Thank you. Good afternoon. The after lunch slot is always a challenge, so I'm going to do my best to keep you awake. I've spoken a couple of times this week in London, and I've received very warm response, so I love it here. What can I say about that? I'm here to enlist you in thinking about a new story about how humans get things done. I think this is particularly applicable to the civil service. We all know the old story, and by we I mean just about everybody on planet Earth is taught by our parents, by our schools, by our culture, a story about how we do things together, don't do things together. Biology is war, in which only the fiercest competitors survive. Businesses and nations succeed only by dominating or defeating the competition. Politics is about your side winning at all costs. But over about the last 10 years, I've seen the outlines of a new story emerging from new knowledge that comes from a wide variety of fields. It's a narrative in which competition is still central, but it shrinks a little bit to leave room for what we now know about cooperative arrangements and complex interdependencies. That image of the young woman with the hijab and the flag raising her fist, I think that's going to win a Pulitzer Prize. And of course, the dramatic and tragic images of the young people dying on the streets there, transmitted to the world in real time around the barriers, I think have changed the way we look at reporting for events. Of course, let the reader beware. Who knows which of these things are true? In fact, the U.S. State Department asked Twitter not to shut down for scheduled maintenance so that the people in Iran could get their messages out. What's interesting to me, again, remember I was talking about these things evolving, how rapidly it evolved. About 24 hours into this, a filtered site, super filtered Iran election info for the easily overwhelmed. So here we began to see people taking these tweets and using some ways of filtering them for veracity. I think we're going to see more and more of these filters coming up. There's something called crowdsourcing the filter, in which if you can gather an online community of trusted sources and use them to look at this flow and try to pick out the truth from the maybe not so true, or the nonfiction from the fiction. We're going to see more and more of this. There's a lot of concern about the future of journalism. We now have millions of reporters, but somebody needs to verify, contextualize, and put into a coherent narrative all of that massive flow of information. That's what journalists have done. That's what they will continue to do. But journalists are not going to be the only reporters anymore. So I didn't stop thinking about this coevolution of media and collective action, the way people do things together when they can communicate in new ways, when I finished my book. And in fact, the more I learned about it, the more I became convinced that we are humans because we use communication media to do things together in new ways. If you think about it, our primate ancestors were about a meter tall. They weighed about 30 kilos. They didn't have claws. They didn't have fangs. They couldn't fly. They couldn't run very fast. They came down out of the trees where they were protected onto the savanna where they were surrounded by saber-toothed everything, and eventually ended up being the most feared predator on the savanna. We don't have direct physical evidence, but it's pretty certain that the ability to communicate, to organize collective defense and collective food gathering is how that began to happen. And of course, for millions of years, actually for hundreds of thousands of years, humans, Homo sapiens, pretty much like us, dressed them up like us, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, wandered the earth in small hunter-gatherer groups, mostly extended families. But fairly recently, we saw that in the records, in the archaeological records, that those extended family groups began to band together into larger groups who weren't related to each other, and they started hunting larger things. Humans require fresh protein. If you're not fortunate enough to live near the ocean and have an abundant supply of fish, you've got to hunt. And it takes a lot of rabbits to keep your family going. If you can band together and you can hunt something really big, a new form of wealth appears on the scene. More protein than the hunter, or the hunter's family can eat before it rots. So the question arises, did the people who ate but didn't hunt or weren't related to the hunters owe something to the people who did hunt? And I think that probably drove some new kinds of social forms. Jump ahead to about 8,000, 10,000 years ago, people settled in agricultural valleys, began to build cities and empires, mostly out of mud bricks. And in fact, mud, or more properly, clay, became the next medium for human communication. Took a couple thousand years to move from marks on clay to writing. And that evolution happened because of the people who kept accounts for the emperor. If you contributed 3 bushels of grain to the granary, then you got a little piece of clay that enabled you, that authorized you to withdraw 3 bushels of grain from the granary. So it was the emperors and these new kinds of social organizations and the people who kept track of things for those emperors who really were in charge of this new communication medium. And of course, eventually, the alphabet evolved, and suddenly an enormously powerful tool for transmitting knowledge across time and across space became available to an elite. For thousands of years, this very powerful, pretty much secret code was confined to those who were chosen by the emperor, who were chosen by the pope. The elite scribes who were able to read and write for thousands of years were suddenly disintermediated about 500 years ago by the printing press. You know, during Gutenberg's lifetime, about 30,000 books were handwritten in Europe. Within 50 years of the invention of the printing press, 30 million books became available. And more importantly, the population of literates expanded, became not a tiny elite, but in fact, a significant portion of the population. And those people began to do things together that illiterate populations had been unable to do. So science, how do we know about the physical world? That had really depended forever on geniuses arising. You needed an Aristotle, you needed a Newton to apprehend the world in a new way. But the real genius of Baconian science, Cartesian science, the science of the literate age, was that if you had a sufficiently literate population and they knew the rules, they could perform their own observations, their own experiments, they could describe them, they could publish them. And as Newton said, he stood on the shoulders of giants. People could build knowledge together. Of course, Martin Luther was not the first priest to object to the practices of the church. Famously, he nailed up his 95 Theses on the cathedral door. He happened to do it at a time when printers were looking for new markets, and within 3 years, 300,000 copies of broadsides of those handwritten 95 Theses were available. And there were the revolutions of the 18th century. Monarchies began to be replaced by parliaments and congresses. In my country, our revolution from your country was really a literate revolution. It was organized by what was called the committees of correspondence, people writing to each other. And after the revolution was over, these 13 former colonies argued about what form of government to take in the form of printed letters to the editor. We know them as the Federalist Papers today. So I'm not saying that the scientific revolution or the Reformation or the emergence of democratic governance was created by the printing press. I'm saying that the printing press, that medium of communication, made possible a literate population. And that literate population figured out we can do things we weren't able to do before. We're seeing that happen now. We're seeing that happen in your field. And I think in many ways it's going to enable you to do your job better by enlisting an entire population to help you. They're already doing it in many ways. Of course, new forms of economic production came along as well. Markets are at least as old as the crossroads, but capitalism as we know it derived from a number of post-Gutenberg inventions, from double-entry bookkeeping from northern Italy, limited liability insurance from London, the corporation from Amsterdam. These all had to do with print, with literate populations, with populations that taught people how to do bookkeeping. I don't think we are finished inventing new forms of economic production. In fact, famous left-wing publications in the US are beginning to recognize that we're beginning to do things in new ways online. I won't get into a lot of detail about this, but technology companies like IBM and HP and Sun open sourced their proprietary programming code, made it available for anyone to use, not out of altruism, but because they were able to enlist the services of a lot of programmers and then sell their own services as consultants on how do you use this now free code in your business. IBM went from 0% of its revenues coming from open source consulting services to its major source of revenues in 4 years. Toyota famously treated its suppliers not as a market, but as a network, and grew to dominate the automobile industry. They're not out of business yet, but of course, General Motors and Chrysler are. Eli Lilly, in the famously secretive and proprietary pharmaceutical industry, created a market for scientific solutions. They call it innocentive. Anybody, whether you worked for Eli Lilly or even were in the pharmaceutical industry, who had a scientific problem to solve could put it up, and if somebody else felt that they could solve that problem, you made a deal. So within a couple of weeks, a pharmaceutical chemist trying to create a new medicine who was stumped by a synthesis, could not get to the final stage, put his problem up on innocentive, and turned out a petroleum chemist in Kazakhstan had the answer to that. Again, these are just the beginning. Open source programming has shown that thousands of programmers, many of whom don't know each other, have been able to create software in both the browser and the operating system field that's challenged Microsoft, the monopoly provider, working without the incentives of the market as we know them, and without the organization of the firm as we've known it. Google and Amazon opened their crown jewels to the world. So Google's AdSense, its automatic placement of ads, they made available to bloggers. So hundreds of thousands of bloggers put some code on their website. Google automatically places ads. Those bloggers make a little money. Some of them make real money. And of course, Google makes big money.
Amazon has made the application programming interface to its engine available to millions of people. I'm going to move quickly through this. We all know about Wikipedia. I want to show you some things that are maybe a little, people have put their spare computing time together to create the world's largest supercomputers to help scientists figure out how proteins fold. After the tsunami in Asia, the Asian Tsunami Blog organized emergent collective response from civilians. After Hurricane Katrina in the US, the Katrina People Finder enabled people to find each other's relatives through a wiki. A man by the name of Jim Gray went missing on his sailboat one day in San Francisco Bay. His friends got fresh photographs from NASA, divided those into 500,000 images. 12,000 volunteers looked through 500,000 images through Amazon's Mechanical Turk. They didn't find Jim Gray, but there was no how to find your friend formula. They just used the tools available to them. About 12,000 people on Twitter contributed $250,000 in February of this year to provide clean water to 25,000 people in Africa. So I think we have to think about what's going to happen in the future with most of the world's population walking around with a supercomputer in their pocket. In the city of Cologne, Germany, any citizen who notices that there is an architectural deficiency or a danger, some kind of municipal problem, could put it on a Google map. Some of you, most of you may know about Fix My Street here in the UK. Theyworkedforyou.com, about your members of parliament. More recently, interestingly, the information from the Telegraph, the data about MPs' expenses, their rivals at The Guardian have crowdsourced this. So any citizen can go through that data and see if they can find something unusual to report. In New Zealand, they've used a wiki to create a law, the Policing Act. They actually enabled citizens to rewrite the wording of that proposed law. Again, here in the UK, Do the Green Thing is an experiment in changing social behavior through the use of social media. Aim is to reduce CO2 emissions by doing green things and then sharing and displaying your green activity to encourage your peers to follow suit. So in this country, you are way ahead in terms of providing access to people who did not previously have access to the technology. Now you've got a politician, the science minister on Twitter, DigiGov, setting government digital policy with your involvement on Twitter. I think that this is pretty interesting here. I just want to read you a brief quote from the Social Reporter. If we want to use social media to improve public services and local democracy, build social capital, and tackle every other known social ill innovatively, of course, in the face of spending cuts, inevitably, then there isn't one big idea or intervention that will work. It's about cultivating the whole of the digital British garden. More or less the point that I'm trying to get to here. Here's a good book that's coming out here in the UK. If you want to read much more about it, then I can tell you, take a look at Social by Social. I think we have only begun to understand the combination of technology and social activity that's enabling people to do things. As we understand it better, we can design better services. You can design better services to do your job with the help of your fellow citizens. If you want to look at several years of research that I've done with the Institute for the Future, see some more material about the underpinnings of this emerging science of cooperation, you can go to cooperationcommons.com. So, if you want to build a bridge, knowing something about mathematics and the nature of different materials is going to amplify your capability. If you want to cultivate crops, understanding the constituents of fertile soil is going to be useful. Similarly, whether your enterprise is civil service, microfinance, disaster response, conflict resolution, sustainable development, responsive politics, or citizen journalism, understanding the dynamics of cooperation and collective action can multiply your effectiveness. Thank you. It looks like we have a few minutes here for questions, so if you do have a question, please use one of the microphones that Tiffany here and another person have available. So we have a question up here.
Okay, going to next one.
The examples you give of participation to challenge government are very exciting and colourful and active. Have you got any more examples, particularly with reference to Obama moving from campaigning to administration, of where participation to help actually administer public services is going?
In fact, I don't have the exact name of the websites, but there are a number of websites that have been started by the Obama administration to enable public comment. Also, you know, this goes both ways. Input from the public comment on impending legislation, suggestions on how to do things. In fact, there's a movement to try to enlist as many American citizens as possible to solve problems that may be useful to the civil servants in the US who are trying to solve those problems. A friend of mine has written a book recently called Wiki Government. She is now in the Obama administration. It works both ways. The other way is transparency of the operations of government. So the Sunlight Foundation, which is outside of government, and look at the Sunlight Foundation in that regard, is working with the Obama administration to make the wording of bills available to the public so that they can know exactly what's in them. They also, some of you may or may not know what an RSS feed is, but it's a way to use a web browser to subscribe to information as it is published. They are putting RSS feeds out for all of the expenditures of the stimulus money that's being spent by the government. So as it's being spent by each department has a mandate to make it available immediately. So I think we're going to see whether the attempt by the Obama administration to bring information in and information out succeeds. They're just beginning. So I would suggest looking at this Wiki Government by Beth Simone Noveck, N-O-V-E-C-K. It's a new book that's coming out, and just look up her name and some of the things that she's writing about it. She's kind of in charge of trying to bring people's ideas in. They're using wikis and blogs and comments, and we'll see how that works. And the Sunlight Foundation. Sunlight Foundation does something a little bit like this Guardian site does. It takes a look at what we call earmarks, which are our congressional representatives put onto bills about other things, riders that allocate money for their constituents to get them elected, and most of this happens at the last minute and most people don't know about it. So what they're doing is they're getting the wording of bills as soon as it's available, and they're enlisting thousands of people online to go through that and find who is adding $100 million for pig farmers in Iowa to a bill about public safety. Another question? Good question. If I had known you were going to ask that, I'd have some specific sites for you. Here's a question here in the front row.
Thank you for your energy. I have read probably all your books, I think.
Thank you, you're the one.
Well, I thank you. I thank you. I mean, you've made a huge contribution, and in particular, just by documenting stuff that wasn't happening here, and it happened in California, and in a sense, it only happened in California. And I'm a journalist, and what I've been obsessed by since I first used an Apple IIb is the possibility that every press office on earth put one copy of new information where every journalist can see all about breaking news from all points of view, but only from organisations that actually take responsibility for the facts and opinions that they utter. And I suspect that might be close to your heart.
Yes, the future of newspapers, don't ask me. If I had the solution to that, I would be talking to somebody right now about that. Future of journalism, I think, is extremely healthy. We have tools that we've never had before. We need to be able to identify trusted sources. I'm afraid that the future of the internet is in danger from an inundation of misinformation, disinformation, spam, urban legends, hoaxes. I think the answer is not really a professional class or a technology, but a literacy. I talked about that at Reboot Britain. Some of you may have heard me talk about that. We need to teach kids how to find the answer to anything you want, any question you might want, by asking the right question, and how to determine whether the answers you get from the internet are accurate or not. It's not easy, but it's not that hard. It requires a kind of frame of critical thinking that we need to begin to teach quite early. Education is no longer strictly a matter of delivering facts from the teacher to the student. It's a matter of encouraging students to find out whether what I'm saying is true or not. We have a question over here.
Yeah, you seem to be describing a future world in which society becomes increasingly reliant on some form of technology. My question to you is, how does society and the world react if that technology meets some sort of cataclysmic event? So I'm thinking sort of a solar flare or something.
You know, there's a person I met because he follows me on Twitter here in London. His name is Vinay, I forget his last name, but he's Hexayurt on Twitter, and he's very concerned about nuclear war, or the internet going down, or Mumbai just started running out of water. Disasters. How can we get individuals and communities to be able to be self-sufficient in those circumstances without waiting for the government to come to their rescue? So I think it's a very important point. It's not impossible to do. His Hexayurt is something that you can build for $200. It's got foil, reflective foil on the outside. It's built out of basic wood. It uses a kind of Bucky Fuller shape. The way it's built is that it takes cold from the ground and mist from the ceiling and provides coolness during heat. The reflection enables it to stay cool. It also keeps people warm enough so that they don't freeze. So emergency shelter, decentralizing the ability to use water sources. You know, of course, we've been dependent on technology for quite a while. How does the food get into London and the water, and how does the sewage get out of London? I'm always amazed when I go to Rome that this place has been operating with a couple of notable interruptions for, 2,500 years. So urban humanity has been dependent on technology for a long time. The technology is becoming more complex, the interdependencies and the ways it can break down. We're going into a world in which sometimes nothing might work and nobody will know why. So how do we become, I think, more independent in terms of, so my friend that I met here in London said there's 6 ways to die. You're too hot, you're too cold, injury, you can starve. Gee, I can't remember the other two, but so how do we provide ways that for individuals and communities to provide those basic need. So we need to begin thinking about that kind of not only interdependence but independence. You know, the people who provide services ad hoc are the ones around the world who live in what are called slums. And in fact, they're incredibly ingenious. There's more concrete being poured by people in illegal housing in Mumbai and Nairobi and Rio de Janeiro than by all of the legal construction companies in the world. Okay, one more question.
Hi, I wondered how you would respond to the point that it's been made that in some ways social media can reduce choice or reduce investigation of all of the options. So you mentioned the website Dig, where people vote up particular stories, and the argument going that human nature being what it is, that people follow what's been most popularly voted for, and that reduces their choice, reduces their knowledge of options, rather than continuing to look further afield.
Yes, of course, there's nothing new about people following what is popular rather than what is the most useful or the most accurate. Social media simply magnify our capability to follow the herd in the wrong direction. So again, I mentioned these literacies. I think that kind of literacy comes into effect there. Is this something that rises to the top on a website, rising to the top because it's the best, or because it appeals to some part of human nature? It's entertaining, or it's sensational. I don't have the answer to that. I don't think, again, I think the answer is education. I think that people need to be able to determine for themselves and not rely entirely on the herd or on the official sources. They need to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff themselves. It's a challenge. The good news is that the capital investment in teaching something new is not so high. You don't have to build new schools. We've already got schools. We simply need to begin teaching people to question the kind of information that they are getting online. All right, with that, I'm sorry we don't have more time. I'd love to talk about this with you all day, but I thank you for your attention.